Welcome back, Chappelle. All right. Great first day back of a new quarter, right? Everybody's great starting at a hundo, which everybody really loves, right? So, and we're getting into our first flip of this unit that we've already started. All right, so now look, big thing is remember, I will let you know in the next couple days when your first test for the second quarter is going to be, but you need to go ahead and get geared up for a pretty tough one because the Middle Ages is a tough unit, right? It's a tough unit because you got to wrap your mind around multiple concepts. You got to understand that, like, while Western Europe was struggling in the term that would be later referred to as the Dark Ages by Renaissance thinkers, there was still European power going on in the Byzantine Empire, right? All the way up for another 1,000 years up until 1453 AD, right? And then also during this entire time, you've got the Eastern kingdoms of the Asians, or the Asiatic kingdoms, the African kingdoms, and the Arabic kingdoms that are blossoming and making tons of money and having a golden age from 500 to about 1400 AD, right? So the big thing that we talked about today in class, though, is we talked about what the Middle Ages is, how many time periods it has, and then we also talked about who these barbarians are, right? So who they are, where they came from. And we got to start out by talking about that they are slowly going to begin to organize. And I had a phenomenal question from Haven Fortenberry, which, if you're watching this tomorrow, Haven, happy birthday. So, big thing, though, Haven asked a great question at the very end of class, and everybody was getting packed up and stuff. She said, where did these kings come from, though? How do you go from being just a tribe to having a kingdom, right? So that's a great question. And a lot of it starts out with the fact that they are eventually going to put hereditary leaders into power. But what Haven's question was is, where did those leaders come from? So somewhere off to the side, right? Somewhere off to the side of this little section, right? You need to kind of jot down, where did they come from, right? And the place where they came from is that many historians believe that they were what you would originally call a warlord, right? A warlord, W-A-R-L-O-R-D, a warlord, right? And a warlord just basically means a guy that controls a large number of soldiers, right? Now, interestingly enough, right, Rome was super big, right? So does it reason to say that there would have been some generals from the Roman Empire and from the Roman entire entity itself left over? It would, right? And so when Rome's government fell and their civilization fell, doesn't necessarily mean that the people that lived in it all died out like that, right? So they're going to have a lot of these generals left over, right? And a lot of these generals control these armies, right? And a lot of those armies at the time were these things called conscript armies that were actually made up of these people you would refer to as barbarians, right? So when Rome collapsed, who else did they have to look to? Their general, right? And you would refer to these generals as something like a warlord, right? And so what eventually happened is a lot of these warlords started going to battle with one another. The one that would end up winning and being the most victorious because he took on that burden of leadership and he took on that really, really scary version of leadership because he could easily die, right? But once he became victorious and took over enough land, he then gave land to his supporters, particularly his officers in the military, and he would become their king and they would become his nobles, right? Nobles, right? Nobles are wealthy families, right? So it's important to understand that is where they came from, right? That's what we believe happened is these barbarian leaders probably led military groups, right? And that's how Rome was started. That's how parts of Greece were started, right, with the Spartans. So you got to understand that concept of a warlord taking over a large amount of land and then declaring themselves their leader, that's kind of where these kings came from, right? So now, but the barbarian tribes, when they would do this, they would put hereditary leaders in charge, right? And what I mean by hereditary leaders is when I am the king, if I should die, my son takes over the leadership, and then his son after him, and then their sons and sons and sons and sons, right? So that is the idea of hereditary. It passes on to people within their family, right? And that's mainly just an attempt to keep power. All right, so and also to avoid war, because as we know, when Rome fell, civil wars is a big reason why they fell. And so a big way that a big empire or a kingdom can fall very quickly is by having civil war. How do you avoid civil war? Hereditary leaders, right? Now, they're going to begin to also make permanent settlements in Europe, right? As in, they're going to build cities, and they're going to build outposts, and they're going to build actual little constructed areas that they would actually live in. The kings would actually build a very, very large complex that they would live inside of. A city would spread off of that, and that's how you ended up getting capital cities of Europe, right? So now look, for example, Londinium, London, right? London, England was originally a Roman city, right? So a lot of these other cities are founded based off the Romans, right? So it's not like the Romans just disappeared. it's kind of like almost like it changed shape. Now that the Roman leadership has collapsed, right, and the Republic is no more, now you've got all these warlords now starting all these new areas, right? And so they're going to single-handedly destroy everything of intelligence, the barbarians are, which is pretty tough, and all those things we talked about in class today, like Roman amazingness, right? So it's going to go with them. But, like, nice job, fellas. Like, right, you're, like, getting started out. Now, speaking of our first warlord, we believe our first true warlord is a guy by the name of Clovis, right? So Clovis is going to be a massive figure in European history, right? Say his name for me. Clovis, right? Clovis. Some people are always like, he doesn't sound that important. He actually is super important because he's going to be the first person that we would refer to as like a quote-unquote king, right? So we would actually refer to him as like a king of Europe, right? So, and this is back when basically everything was still chaos, right? Because look at the year. 466. That means that Clovis was 10 years old when the Ostrogoths sacked Rome and Rome fell, right? But by his adulthood, he is going to take over huge swaths of territory. Now, he may have been a Roman military leader. We believe that he may have been one of the leftover military leaders that as the empire was falling, he was probably a leader of a very large army, right? And what he's going to do is he's going to use that army to conquer a bunch of these competing tribes, right? And regional Roman political leaders, right? Like all these leftover Romans, like all these leftover Roman governors and these leftover Roman people, they're going to start taking them over. He starts taking them over. And he is that kind of quintessential, what we just described because of Haven's amazing question, a warlord, right? And so he's going to conquer a bunch of those little places, and he's going to kind of consolidate all of them under his leadership now, right? And he becomes what we would refer to as the first king in Europe since the fall of Rome, right? And so one big thing he's going to do, though, also, he's going to convert to Catholicism. Why is that a little interesting, right? He was originally a pagan, right? So a pagan. A pagan means that you worship multiple gods. Europeans would refer to the Romans as pagans, right? So he had a pagan faith and like he believed in multiple gods and stuff like that at one point. But eventually he was convinced by his wife to convert to Catholicism. Now this is going to be a big deal because if the very first king of Europe, Clovis, right, is going to convert to Catholicism, that's going to give more space for the Catholic faith and Christianity to grow. Something that you should write over on the margin, right to the right, Christianity is going to spread like crazy during the Middle Ages. You're going to see kings adopted. You're going to see kings adopt ruling authority along with popes. You're going to see a very massive influx of Christianity, and then ironically enough, a shunning of other religions, which is really tough and awful, but it's not like we haven't seen it before. The Romans did it to the Christians first. All right, so it's like they kind of learned from their oppressor right now. But the big thing about it is he was basically convinced by his wife over a very long period of time, because his wife at the time that he married in 493 is going to be like, you know what you should do? You should convert to that Christianity thing, right? A lot of your subjects are Christians, right? And like, the pagan Roman gods are barely holding on. Why don't you convert? Why don't you convert? Why don't you convert? And she just starts nagging him like this. Like, come on, convert. Do it. It's going to give you more power and ruling authority, right? Because then you'll also have the Pope over in Rome, and you can kind of rule along with him, right? And he's like, no. Well, actually, the Pope didn't really exist yet, right? The Pope didn't exist yet because it's not until 1053 that the Great Schism happens. Now, but the big thing about it is he's like, come on, convert. And she finally convinces him, right? After killing one of his sons on accident. So what ended up happening was his wife said, convert, it'll give you more power. And Clovis says, no, and he refuses to do it. He wants to stay pagan, right? Now, unfortunately, though, his wife takes one of his sons, who is destined to be the king after Clovis dies, and has him baptized. Well, the problem is that baptismal water was not clean, and then he ended up getting an infection, and he died, right? So, and he's like, well, I'm definitely not converting to this Christianity shenanigans now. I just killed one of my kids. She was like, look, I was just a test run. She takes his other son, goes to like baptize him. He gets an infection and almost dies, right? But doesn't die. And so eventually Clovis is like, fine, okay? If it makes you stop trying to like baptize, borderline kill my kids, I will convert to Christianity, right? And so Clovis's Christianity conversion, right, the baptism of Clovis, is a very, very large event that occurs throughout in European history. His baptism signifies the leading authorities of Europe are now converting to Christianity, right? So, like, this is very, very important, okay? So now, look, make sure you have that, okay? I know I just talked about a guy converting for, like, forever and a day, but it is what it is, right? Then he's also going to be the first one that starts a dynasty in Europe, right? And his dynasty is referred to as the Merovingian Dynasty, right? So say it with me again. Merovingians, right? He's a Merovingian, right? Clovis, Merovingian, right? So he begins this thing called the Merovingian Dynasty. Now, he is considered the founder of France. He is considered the modern-day father of France, right? Because he consolidated the Frankish people, right? And he created the Frankish kingdom. And he created the first empire or country or territory or area or whatever you want to call it since the fall of Rome. He's also attributed with this as well, being the first one to sport the symbol of ruling authority in France, the fleur-de-lis, right? Which actually means a lily flower, right? So the fleur-de-lis is meant to look like a lily, and it's supposed to symbolize the ruling authority of the king by also showing he's a Christian because it's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? So boom, right? So the ruling authority symbolized by that fleur-de-lis was first symbolized with Clovis, right? Now, the bad thing about Clovis, right, he does have some downsides. Jot this down really quick. One bad thing. He doesn't really encourage intelligence, right? He just consolidated a very large amount of area. And then his sons following him would continue to take over these areas, right? So the Frankish kingdom following Clovis's death kept growing, right? Kept getting much, much larger, and they kept taking over more territory, right? And so the Frankish kingdom by 768 is going to get pretty large, right? So, and then this guy comes in, right? This guy, very important figure. This dude is the most powerful leader that existed during the early Middle Ages. This is all still during the early Middle Ages. He is a boss, and his name is Charlemagne. You could say he is the man, right? Now, he is going to become the very first powerful, strong, authoritative leader of this entire area, right? So he takes the Frankish kingdom, right, at its height, okay, and he expands it even further, okay? And he creates the Carolingian Empire, right? And he creates this by expanding off Merovingian success, and also he creates a system where his family is going to be a very, very large and in charge, right? Now, Charlemagne is going to also be crowned for the first time by the Pope, right? Pope Leo III, one of the first and earliest popes, is going to crown him king of a place called the Holy Roman Empire. Some of you are like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, back up. I thought the Romans were gone, all right? They are, right? So, but the very first quote-unquote country that existed after that, you're not going to call it, oh, it's the Frankish kingdom, right? They refer to it as the Holy Roman Empire, right? So, and they refer to it as the Holy Roman Empire because their leaders had converted to Christianity, and Roman because, of course, they had most of their allegiance and most of their, like, terms of intelligence linked back to what you would refer to as Roman, right? So Charles the Great, a.k.a. Charlemagne, which literally means like Carlos Magnus, right? Or Charlemagne literally means Charles the Great, right? But big thing is that he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, right? And a lot of this happens because Charlemagne defended the Pope, right? Pope Leo III was at risk of falling prey to these people known as the Saxons and the Vikings, right? Who were leading massive raids all over Europe, and he ends up becoming one of the large military leaders that actually protects the Pope from being destroyed, right? And so what does the Pope do? He crowns him the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, or basically the kingdom of Christendom, right? So, and by doing this, the Pope is doing two things, right? He is, one, showing his authority over the king, right, which is going to come up later, right? The Pope is saying, like, I am blessing you with this ruling crown. But also Charles the Great is basically saying, but I lead this area, right? You do not do that. So we're going to see, write this down, the seeds of aggression between the popes and kings are going to pop up during this, right? So he is going to be crowned king, though, of this place called the Holy Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So now, this other big thing, though, he is known as the father of modern-day Europe, right? Now, he united a bunch of barbarian tribes in the West, and he is brought Europe some stability, right? Other really big thing and very important thing about him is he created this thing known as the Carolingian Renaissance, right? And in the Carolingian Renaissance, he's going to encourage people to learn to read, to learn to write, to learn to use a thing called Carolingian minuscule, which is actually a writing format that he adopted in his empire so that people that ran certain state governing ideas could all communicate with each other using the same script or the same alphabet and the same writing. And it was all based off the Roman alphabet, right? So Carolingian minuscule became a very big thing as well. He also, under his reign, is going to see the adoption of some of the very, very first art, right? So the actually, like, decent art anyway. Renaissance. Yeah. The Carolingian Renaissance is going to see the adoption of, now it ain't great, right? Like it ain't the best thing you've ever seen, but it's still the adoption of writing systems, right? Carolingian minuscule, and then also the adoption of some art forms as well, right? So the Carolingian Renaissance, started by Charles the Great, Charlemagne, is a very, very, very important process, right? Now, unfortunately, though, bad day for Charles, though. He actually has nothing but daughters. Well, actually, that's not true. He had a few sons, and his sons are going to end up kind of chopping his empire up later on during this thing called the Treaty of Verdun that you don't need to worry about nor know. But he is the father of this modern-day Europe area, right? And so this is going to be what Charlemagne adds, right? He adds this area, right? He actually takes over the former Roman, like, empire, former city of Rome, strips it from the Ostrogoths, right? And establishes an area where the first, like, some of the earliest popes can actually reside, right? So this is a big deal. This area is going to be referred to right here as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, later on, following Charlemagne's death and this thing called the Treaty of Verdun, they end up splitting it up, and it kind of basically forms France and Germany, right? So, like, well, but it's going to be France and the Holy Roman Empire, right? So, now, with that, though, his biggest advent was the fact that he defended massive amounts of European land from these people, right? So the Vikings, right? So the Vikings, or the era of the Vikings, right? So the Vikings are a warrior culture that Charlemagne would always battle against. So write that down, right? Charlemagne always battled against these people known as the Vikings, right? Now the Vikings are from where you would refer to most often right now as being from a place called Denmark, right? They're the Danes, right? The Danes are the Vikings, right? So now the Vikings, or the Vikings, as like I've had kids call them before, which is not okay. The Vikings are a warrior culture from the region of Denmark, or what you would sometimes also refer to as Scandinavia, right? When we're talking about Scandinavia, we mean Sweden, Norway, Finland, right? Denmark, that upper area right there. So if we're looking at this map right here, we're talking about they're all from this northern territory, Denmark, and then also the Scandinavian region up at the top. They also settled places like Iceland and Greenland and other areas as well. Now, big thing about the Vikings, though. The Vikings were a very aggressive culture, right? Had several different factions, several different tribes, had very famous leaders as well. Eric the Red was a big one. Leif Erikson, all right, as in the son of Eric the Red, right? Erikson, son Erikson, Leif Erikson. Happy Leif Erikson Day.
Hey, everybody! It's Leif Erikson Day! Hinga-dinga-durgan! Ahoy, Patrick! It's Leif Erikson Day! There's a note.
SpongeBob went to get more giant paper. Patrick. P.S. Happy Leif Erikson Day! Yerger-hinder-dinger.
Aw, so much for that.
So, like, anyway, the Vikings are going to have these major leaders, and they're going to raid throughout all of Europe. And these raids are going to end up leading to the biggest construct that's ever existed, right? And it has to do with feudalism, right? Because what a lot of European leaders are realizing is as the Vikings are coming through and they're invading these different regions, they actually invaded Constantinople, they invaded all these different areas. What's happening is these kings like Charlemagne are realizing we are leaving our areas, our land, open to invasion, right? We need to figure out a system so that they can protect themselves, right? How can they protect themselves? What can we do? We can't just leave our laborers sitting out in the middle of a field. So what is created to make a system of protection, which ends up being one of the worst things ever created ever, has to be doing with it's called feudalism, right? So write that down, feudalism. This right here is feudalism, okay? So Feudalism. So you need to draw this chart real quick, okay? And feudalism is going to be a direct result of those Viking invasions, right? This group of people that's raiding all of Europe that Charlemagne is fighting against, that Clovis never had to deal with because they weren't really there yet, right? So feudalism is going to be the system of land ownership and protection that Europe is going to fall into that they don't come out of for several, like almost 2,000 years, right? So like almost. It's like 1,000 and a half. So really quick though, feudalism is set up like this. So when you're looking at the feudal system, this is kind of like the Roman government chart, but it's just different, right? So you got the king at the very, very top, right? We talked about where kings came from. There were these warlords. They controlled large armies, right? They established cities and capitals and hereditary leadership, and that's going to be where our king comes from, right? But we have our king or our ruling person. We talked about Clovis today, talked about Charlemagne today, talked about several other ones, right? Now the Pope, some of you are like, where's the Pope go? Pope's different. He's outside of this thing, right? Now the king owned the entire country. And every single place, country, kingdom, whatever, the Frankish kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire, he would then slice up different parts of it and give different land plots, or fiefs is what they're called, fiefs, F-I-E-F, to his lords or nobles, right? So he would then create these noble families. He'd be like, okay, the Fortenberries live here, the Greens live there, the Montalbanos live there, and they all are very wealthy. The Carols are over there, the Ferreros, the blah. Like, so these very wealthy, very, very kind of upper-end families would control these different areas. Now, the people that would work directly underneath these lords or nobles were called vassals, right? Now, vassals were these different most of them coming from these other noble families, but they were usually trained knights or military leaders that would be in charge of protecting the entire area, right? So you have your vassals or your knights. And then at the very, very bottom, we got our serfs, right? Big thing you need to understand, write this down, serfs are not slaves, right? Serfs are just peasants, right? So serfs are the poor, right? They are the poorest people and the largest class in the feudal system, right? They are not slaves, though, because slave kind of brings in the idea that you bought that person. Not the case here, right? Serfs are bound to the land by a contract. Jot that down, right? Bound to the land by a contract, like a lease. Hence the name landlord, right? If you've ever rented or your family's ever rented an apartment, you have a landlord that you got to pay rent to, right? And you are literally bound to that place for a certain amount of time, right? We literally have feudal aspects still a part of our modern-day society. But the serfs would sign a contract agreeing to live there and work the land for a certain amount of time, and what the serfs would get is protection from people like the Vikings by the vassals and the knights, and they would have to provide the things that they were farming back to the nobles and also possibly pay taxes, right? Now, what do the serfs give back to this system? This is their era, right? They work. That is how they're allowed to stay there. The vassals, however, provide military service, right? They provide protection, authority, military service, military leadership, and if a war occurs, they are then sent to the king to form larger armies as well, and so they can actually go and fight wars against other countries, other new popping up states in Europe, and then you also have the lords and the nobles who pay taxes back to the king, right? So make sure you have this written down in your notes, and then each plot of land that we just said, if you don't already have it written down, was known as a fief, and it is believed that this system, this is really interesting, is believed that this system was established from old Roman villas, right? So these Roman villas were these massive complexes. Remember we talked about the problems of Roman conquest and how you had all these really wealthy patricians that were buying up land from these really, really poor veterans, right? So those wealthy patricians lived in these places called villas. There were these really, really large agricultural estates, right? So what we believe is that the kings of Europe, the first kings like Clovis and Charlemagne, they're just going to take those old Roman villas and turn those into fiefs, right? They're going to turn them into places where nobles live, right? And so these old Roman villas that were owned by the patricians just became nobles, and it was a transition from the old Rome into Europe, right? So that is where we're going to stop. I hope you all have a great day. I hope you have a great evening. Welcome back to Flipping. Welcome back to Quarter 2. I'll talk to y'all soon.